Welcome to West Fox. Today's topic, why your family doesn't matter with the Force.
Why families don't matter. And here's my brother.
Right? And today we're joined by my brother, Philip. And we're going to be talking about why Rey's parents don't matter in Star Wars, but why they do narratively. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you for having me on. It's an exciting to be able to be a part of the first video from West Fox. I'm truly privileged and honored.
Thank you. It's technically the second, but that's okay. Just kidding. So
Shut up.
we're gonna hit into the kind of the thing that we kind of see pop up here and there in conversations about essentially saying like, oh, we don't care who Rey's parents are, it doesn't matter. And when you look at the larger story in Star Wars, that's never been a really thing. You know, it was something we talked about recently, which was really Luke is the first second generation Jedi in, you know, normal canon. I guess I should step back here and say one thing, kind of a prereq, which is neither of us are super deep into like comic lore or
Certainly not.
book lore. So, you know, I'm sure there's could be some abstract thing of who's had kids. I think we come from the perspective, both of us, from we really enjoy the original trilogy. We grew up with it. You know, we used to like freaking lightsaber on the trampoline with bats with our other brother, who eventually might be on here. But the key thing that we come from is, like I said, what happened in the main movies, both the original trilogy and then the prequel trilogy, and maybe some like high level known canon type stuff. And you're like, oh yeah, lightsaber crystals, cool. They never talk about them really in the trilogy, but we know about them from like the video games. Probably like the KOTOR series, Knights of the Old Republic. Some of that lore probably gets baked into us probably. Some of the video games. So obviously we know that that's not always hard canon. So we know there's a little bit of soft canon in our conversations, but I think that we're coming from the more, you know, big fans of the franchise, but also not so deep into lore that we're drowning in it.
And when it comes to the video games, in particular, like you said, powers are of particular interest. Video games are one thing because they're dynamic and they can be exciting. And so being able to, you know, suck someone's life out or heal oneself while it's useful for gameplay, you kind of have to bring things down to a more simplified level inside of movies. Because eventually you can just go anywhere with that type of power. The point where you even have quote unquote magic force wielders in the EU. And you start to dismantle what it means to have the force and be special, being able to use it.
Yeah, I think that's a great example because, you know, you look at like KOTOR 2. I mean, at the end of that game, if you were to compare that, I mean, you literally just wipe out opponents in that game when you're like leveled up.
Yeah, lightning strike, you can kill 10 or 15 people at one time, and because you've become so powerful. And that would be unappealing in a movie sense because it's like, well, what's the point? This person is near godlike,
right? And I think it's fun, and you could do it. It's fun in a sense of like an OP'd protagonist type thing at like that moment of like friendship. And then they're like, I'm saving my friends. And they're like overcome by power type thing.
Sure.
I think that's where they've struggled with Rey is because everyone's like, oh, she's OP. But it's not that just because she's OP, it's because we don't know why. And that kind of goes into the whole context at the beginning of this part, which is the reason anybody cares about Rey. There's two reasons. First, the first movie makes a big deal about the question, who's her parents? And then the second part of that is it's part of the franchise in the sense of this isn't a one-off story and we're like, oh, who's her parents? It really matters. We literally the advertising for these movies, and especially this last one, the one coming out next week, is the end of the Skywalker story. And as we know, these Skywalkers are pretty light in these movies. So you have to assume that the lead character is somehow tied into the Skywalkers, you know, and we don't know how that is tied in, and we don't know if they will be tying that in. But that's why it came into question. And I think like I said, I think I said it already, but the big thing with, you know, Luke is the first second generation Jedi, because Jedi in the prequels, now granted, I don't think this ever was addressed in the original trilogy. And I don't know if it was intended by George Lucas at that time, because, you know, there's always things that you kind of It's the problem with prequels. You start retconning things. You don't mean to, but you do. And I don't know if when the original movies were created, the Jedi were supposed to be kind of, don't fall in love, don't get married type thing, which we see in the prequels. So you have every Jedi that's been around, at least in the movie canon, essentially would be that every Jedi who's a Jedi for the last couple thousand years didn't come from a Jedi family. There's no lineage is irrelevant when it comes to Star Wars and the Jedi.
Absolutely. And this is one of my biggest problems, of course, with the prequels. You started to create rules that did not need to exist. Again, like you said, there's the Jedi Code, and I understand in other books that exists in some way or another. But again, you start to create those restraints. So then you actually have to make sure that in the prequels, like they did, Luke is this undesirable character that comes from an undesirable relationship that Anakin should not have had. So that being the case, it's odd that Qui-Gon Jinn would then ask Anakin's mom who his dad was, as if that was some type of important indicator.
Yeah, you bring that up, and I think that's a great piece there, which is, does it matter? Again, I don't know if there's something in, that distant EU canon, that kind of stuff, where they're like, oh, if you have a kid that they're too powerful. I think it was just because in the general sense of like normal life, it's a question of like, oh, your son's really skilled at something. Oh, who's the dad? Just that kind of general question. So I don't know if that's a throwaway. Again, we're talking both like in context of the actual universe and also like in a meta sense, because in context,
the meta sense was like, oh, he was I guess you could say an immaculate conception,
right?
Was kind of the meta that they were trying to create,
right? And like the meta is
situation.
Like we think, I think most Star Wars fans, I don't know, not say everyone, but majority think midichlorians were kind of a mistake. The concept, I think, and
without a doubt,
in universe, it doesn't matter. They're like, because if you're living inside the universe, you're like, oh, there's just a thing that is. From external source, us watching from the audience, we're like, oh, those kind of create a whole different context to what the Force is. And I think that was probably generally considered one of the biggest mistakes in the prequels, because it kind of changes what they were, other than probably Jar Jar Binks, which is probably the second most hated thing in there.
Yes.
Now, granted, growing up, I didn't really hate the character, I mean, I remember I was in middle school when that came out, and you're just like, oh, he's kind of overly goofy. It was like that slapstick thing they brought in. I just don't, like I said, the new stuff is, I think, where you kind of even get farther slapstick. I mean, Jar Jar was like, oh, I'm an annoying character jokes. And then the new stuff, you have like your mama jokes pretty much, which is kind of a whole different divergence of humor. But I think humor can be overused in movies nowadays, but that's a long tangent that we don't need to go into. But I think that what it ties into, because the reason the whole lineage thing gets tied into again is Rey's, overpoweredness. And her
it's
training.
Become the explanation for her Mary Sue status is part of the problem. So just to lay a little history, when the questions about her being who she was related to because of the Force Awakens questions started to occur, that was going to be used as cover. With the Rian Johnson movie, it became, well, it doesn't matter. We're separated from and they even started that in the Force Awakens in the beginning. It was like, well, this isn't the Star Wars. This isn't Luke Skywalker anymore. These are new people. They're separate from that. And that was like an argument for people saying, hey, who cares if Mark Hamill wasn't in there for more than 30 seconds? This isn't about him. And then they've tried to turn it back around. And now they want to argue the other side saying, oh, just kidding. It's the end of the Star Wars, the Luke Skywalker complete saga. And because of that, we need to explain away why Rey is a clear Mary Sue. Well, now she has to be related to someone. So that was first, nope, she's not related to anybody because this isn't about Luke. This isn't about Leia. This isn't about Han. So don't get upset that they weren't together. And then it's become, oops, that really actually pissed off a lot of people. And now we're trying to do some PR. And now it's like, oh yeah, this is about them. And also Rey's a Palpatine.
Right. And that's obviously what the trailers and leaks have tended to, because you if she is a legit bloodline Skywalker, the question goes, well, how? And then it starts to feel, contrived, obviously. And that's the problem right now with most of the stuff that's happening in this, most likely going to happen in this movie, is a lot of things are relatively contrived. You can have a new character come in and become something great that doesn't need to be bloodline. I don't think anybody hates that idea in just the general sense of the idea. But I think
no, absolutely not.
I think the problem comes into the training. I don't know why people hate the training thing. We were talking about this recently. You look at shows like Samurai Jack, where you reminded me of this show, the beginning of it anyway, where he spent his entire childhood and young adult years training to be a samurai. He was training with the most elite across the entire planet Earth, and to defeat the evil in the story. And another show that's out recently, anime show, Demon Slayer, the main lead, he spends a couple years training just to get into like the entry level of the training, the school, and just to get into the space where he's allowed to be like a level 1 essentially as part of that clan. And then you have this story, and they're like, nah, we don't need that. We just need, oh, she absorbed the power from another character. Oh, she just is gifted. And you're like, cool, being gifted and super powerful by inherent doesn't make you skilled at something. Just because someone might be above average strength doesn't mean if they don't train and lift weights anytime in their life, they're going to be strong. And there's probably a bazillion examples out there of what someone might have a natural level of intuition to a skill set, but if you don't refine it, and just like people will be like, oh well, Anakin was a Mary Sue, and you're like, well, yeah, a little bit. He was like, oh, I'm flying a pilot trip, and again, that goes into the kind of the silly comedy of that movie, where he's like, yes, oh, let's spin the ship around and we'll shoot things. But that's
a good trick. You're like, oh man.
Yeah, that was just silly comedic relief, unfortunately. But you see him as an adult, though. He's spending an entire life fighting, training under Obi-Wan. He spent, I think, 10 years or more. I forget. He was, what, 7 or 8? No, how old was he in the original? Is he 10 years old? Maybe 12?
If he was 10, he looks a lot small. Pretty small for a 10-year-old.
Yeah, I'd have to look it up. But he was a young kid. And so, he's kind of a young adult in those. And then we know I would say the best usage of like power and his character, I think the best characterization of Anakin, I know we're kind of getting off tangent, but it's part of what it is. The best characterization of Anakin is actually in the Clone Wars animated shorts on that Cartoon Network did.
Yeah, that was the best. That was the best storytelling throughout that entire sequence.
Or 2004, somewhere around the time. You can find them occasionally. They're kind of hard to find, but if you can find them, they're really great. And they're only about 15 minutes long, and they're kind of short stories. They're kind of in the same style. I wonder if it's the same guy that did Samurai Jack.
It is, actually. Okay. I don't know if it's... I know that was the same type of animation. It's a Samurai Jack style.
Very.
That was designed off of.
Lower, like less dialogue, more dialogue than like Samurai Jack, but in that same kind of like show, don't tell, which obviously in a lot of storytelling nowadays doesn't tell you anything. I think that's the problem with these new movies is they tell you very little. You're like, so many questions, so few answers.
Well, it's like they've taken the worst of both. There's over narration where all you do is talk and never show. And it's like, what's the point of a movie? This might as well be an audio drama. And then you have the other side where it's like, well, we don't want to develop a character, but we also don't want to show you us not developing a character. So you get this terrible amalgamation of you show nothing and then also explain nothing. And that's the new type of Disney trilogy, Star Wars.
Yeah.
The originals showed you training, they showed you hard work, but they also did give you exposition about the Force, or they give you exposition about the powers of the dark side lurking around these corners.
Yeah, and I'm not going to pretend. Yeah, and I'm not going to pretend like that Luke's training with Yoda was like some massive long time. I think they said it was a month. I think is what it was. And in the end, he comes out and gets his freaking butt whooped by Vader. Yeah. Like Vader's freaking just chopped off. Yeah, he's just messing with them pretty much. And his goal wasn't to kill him either. His goal was to essentially kind of beat. It's kind of like that parenting perspective where it's like, I'm just going to kind of toy with you until I can be like, see, you're dumb, and now listen to me, type.
Well, yeah, it was his job to recruit him.
Yeah.
That was what his intention was. And of course, intentions are powerful. Like you said, when you run into a character that is clearly going to defeat your protagonist, there has to be a motivation as to why that person doesn't just destroy them, or there has to be some kind of circumstance that's created that keeps them from being able to. And that's another important issue. In The Force Awakens, you have Kylo who's should be far too powerful for Rey. Being shot or not, she's an untrained fighter, and yet she defeats him. His goal was to kill her. Yeah, he makes a line like, join me. But that's just because J.J. Abrams can't think of anything original. He's just a thief. And he's completely unoriginal. And then the same thing in the second movie.
They obviously pulled far too much callback. Like it's that, they're
by far too much callback, you mean outright plagiarism?
Well, relatively,
sure.
yeah. In the space of it, that's where the story, also that's where kind of, where Finn has the struggle, because, the story with him is so backwards too. And maybe we'll do a more in-depth with him too here in the future. But essentially, in a quick one is, he says he's a janitor or something, yet he's with Kylo at the beginning of the movie with his elite force. And unless that's explained somewhere in the movie, again, if there's some weird comic out there, I know that Disney's been putting out a ton of comics and a ton of books to kind of backstory everything of why things have happened. Again, I discount that stuff. You're more than welcome to, I don't say that you're wrong by watching those or reading those. It's totally fine. It's just that I don't think that if you don't explain the main parts of the story in the material, like I said, go back to the original trilogy, everything's pretty much explained. There's obviously things that you're like, oh, you could dive deeper into it. And there's some, I think in the novelizations, there's always a little more detail because that's what books are. That's why every time something's translated from a book to a movie, they're like, oh, there's so much missing. And that's because it'll always be like that. Even when you're reversing it, you're going to be able to add a little more detail of what a character's thinking at every moment. But you don't sit there and go, oh, I need to have 5 novels and 35 comics to explain why things are the way they are. and I don't know how many there are of those, but I know I think there's at least a few Aftermath books that are supposed to explain it, and then they have all the books that were about the movie explaining even more stuff. And to me, that's just kind of, like I said, it's just sloppy writing. Embellishing things is totally fine, but I don't want my story told through, oh, if you want to understand this, you need to go read a ton of material. That's not how I think good movies should be made. I mean, you could look at Lord of the Rings and how both of me and Philip here consider those some of the best movies ever made.
Absolutely.
That's definitely for sure the best full trilogy, and I think the definitive, in my opinion, book to movie translation.
Oh, absolutely. And to take such a epic, detailed book and do what they did with it. You definitely have to give Peter Jackson props for not putting in whatever personal agenda he may or may not have had. And he's actually explicitly talked about him intentionally making sure not to do that. But absolutely, to having read the books numerous times, the parts that Peter Jackson didn't apply, I think were very good calls. Tom Bombadil is always one of the first ones that pops into my mind. It's a weird character. It's a very esoteric.
He's the other wizard, right? He's the no.
He's actually not a wizard. He's
the other one they brought into The Hobbit. That the Hobbits were not good movies, unfortunately.
No, the Hobbits were.
They were unfortunately they actually had legitimately good cast and characters in it, and they just went. They went kiddie with them, I think, which is weird because the original movies hit that perfect like PG-13 tone, that like violence without being gory and having like really deep and strong characters. But for some reason, the Hobbit, they decided to go like PG feeling and slapstick silliness.
And I don't know if it was just an issue of material. Maybe they should have stayed just the 2 movies and they could have allowed for the 2 peaks that naturally occur in that book. It's kind of hard to know exactly, but I completely agree. It was a huge misstep. However, having read the books, other than of course adding Tariel to the story, because there's not enough material to fill up 3 movies. Even there in The Hobbit, there was a pretty good job done. Nowhere near as well as Lord of the Rings for keeping material and extricating material that, while interesting in the books, may not have played as well in theaters. But he did a good job. And that kind of dovetails to what we started this conversation with. We enjoy reading books. We enjoy extra universe information.
The lore.
But if we're going to stay in the world, or lore, but if we're going to stay in the world of film, you have to follow some kind of rules of bringing things back into reality, that when you watch it, it's acceptable and it doesn't sound like you're just trying to write yourself out of a corner. And that's why using even having to use the prequels and then of course the originals to set up the universe that you're in, there are new rules. When George Lucas started his first trilogy, you didn't need to know where the Empire came from, just that it existed, because that's the story that was being told. That was the universe you dropped yourself in, and you have to have protagonists, you have to have antagonists, you have to have a system, whether it's imperial or it's anarchist or somewhere in between. You have to have those things set up to feel a believable world. Once they created that stuff, though, now you have to play by those rules. And so that's why you can have issues like, well, where did this First Order come from within 30 years? Well, I mean, they're so powerful. It doesn't look like they've co-opted technology when other people have done the same thing. And that's just a simple question in those stories that should be answered. And you could say, well, yeah, they never dealt with that, but at least the characters are good. At least the story is good. But when you're not willing to fill in any details in the main medium in which your world exists, which is still film, trying to backfill things with comics and backfill things with any other type of medium is a form of lousy writing. It's allowing other people's imaginations to fill in the gap for what the director, the writers did not want to put in there because it wasn't either worth their time or they actually weren't talented enough to recognize that they were missing things.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think there was a lot of, I think sometimes something that's hurdled at fans sometimes is, oh, we didn't meet what you expected. And to be honest, I'm sure there's always that small handful of people that were like, I want this exactly. But I think the majority of people were just like, I want to see a good movie. I
just want to see lightsabers again.
Yeah, I think
on the big screen.
If anything,
seriously,
I think if anything, if I would say there's one thing that I would say probably majority of fans did want was the original characters together at some point in the movies.
Yes,
and I think that obviously Carrie Fisher's passing away was unexpected. We know narratively, based on what happened in the first movie, that they were never going to have that scene. And I think that would be, if there was one single thing that I think that one thing that fans were expecting in these movies would be that the team up of the original cast having scenes together of some sort. And the fact that those were never around, obviously, I think is a detrimental to the entire new franchise. And obviously that's the questions that get asked and why people are like, oh, who's this? Why is everyone separated? Why did everything kind of fall apart? That's the question. No one really back in the original trilogy asked, oh, why is what's the Republic? What's this council? Because they said council. And so in our brains we go, oh, cool. It's a group of people, which is pretty much accurate. It's a group of people and aliens that do their thing.
Exactly.
The problem is when you start knowing that, oh, look at there's thousands of star systems and thousands of planets, and out of nowhere we have this new group that does it. Like even the money's pretty minimally talked about in Star Wars. Like we know there's bounties on Han Solo and those kind of things, but even people bringing up, we talk about it a little bit when how much did it cost to make the Death Stars and stuff like that. No one really cares about that in the original trilogy. We just know things get made because it's the whole freaking galaxy with probably zillions of beings in it. And so if they...
And slaves available.
Yeah,
right?
you tax everybody a penny, and you're like, oh, we can build 25,000 Death Stars because, it's insignificant cost-wise. But I think the question comes from, oh, we destroy these fleets of ships and doesn't have an impact on the enemy. I think that's where it comes from. And not even in way oh, we keep destroying it. Like if you go back to KOTOR, where we're there's the Forge system. Spoilers if you haven't played the game that's 15 years old.
If you haven't, that's your fault.
Yeah, you really should play it. Like that's
if you're a Star Trek person and you haven't played those games,
say Star Trek,
then
it's Star Wars, bro.
You're lost. Star Wars. If you're a Star Wars, if you're a Star Trek fan, I'm so sorry because that's been destroyed too.
Yeah, we'll get into that one another day. But yeah, they were like, everyone's like, wow, they keep building ships, and the actual like main thing was, oh, there's a dark side, essentially space station that's building planets that's sucking energy from a star. Sounds familiar. Type of weapon, just different type of thing. But yeah, it was just essentially just replicating spaceships for the enemy. And so in that space, you're like, oh, we found this ancient technology. Now, we don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if we see something explained like that in the new ones, not in the movies, of course, but maybe in like auxiliary canon again. Now, probably the last little thing we'll hit on here, because I know we're going a little long, but we'll probably bring up the thing, which is can we talk about the EU and the kind of extended universe and stuff? And both of us probably are on the smaller percentage of people who actually supported Disney originally doing that, with saying, hey, EU is no longer canon. Obviously now it's considered Legends canon. It's kind of the different thing. And the reason I think we both supported that was we understand from a storytelling perspective, trying to keep everything from hundreds of novels and comics from over 30 years, trying to keep that in any sense of expecting your writers to keep everything in context and not messing something up is relatively ridiculous. Now, on the other hand, I do expect writers, when you have these stories, especially nowadays, that totally mess up canon in a general sense. It's kind of like if you had, we're going to use lightsabers and they're like, oh, no, those are laser swords. You're like, what? Those aren't, did you not read the original material? That kind of stuff, which actually does happen in these movies again, which kind of.
Yes, it does, which is infuriating. Again, yeah, it happens in video games. But again, that's just because for gameplay, if you have a lightsaber, you do need to be able to fight somebody. In a movie, if you run into someone who has a gun and you only have a sword, well, guess what? That's just
and you think about it, like lightsabers in real life, someone that's not trained with a lightsaber would be dead.
I'd chop my legs off.
Everyone, you take a stick and start like whacking it around and see how long till you've hit yourself at least once with it. I mean, it's like It's almost like the nunchucks joke that every time you see a nunchucks, someone's gonna hit themselves in the face with it. It's gonna happen. And I mean, like I said, imagine a weapon that literally, if it touches you, is most likely at least removing a bunch of flesh, or straight up just removing limbs. And I can imagine, like I said, anybody who wasn't a legitimately experienced force user / trained person, there's no way that you're not. Like, not really talking about the characters in the movie. We're just talking.
Joel, don't you know if you stand in front of a rock and like half swing at it and like pretend like you stopped right before you touched it, that's training.
Yes, yeah, that's a painful scene. I don't understand that scene. It's kind of. I wonder if that came from. And I know it's like a weird segue for you because you don't really watch a bunch of anime. But there's always there's one training like stance that most they use quite often, and it's like, and it probably is based on something legitimately real.
Is it horse stance?
No, I don't know what the stance is called, but essentially it's where they'll be swinging the samurai sword or the katana straight down, like almost like a downswing, like if you're chopping wood type thing, from like almost like it's
right
over your head,
and you leave yourself completely exposed,
overhead down. And I think it's just like supposed to like build muscle memory. But you'll see characters a lot in shows be doing that. I think even in like live action shows, I feel like I've seen that, but they'll just do it over and over again. And obviously that's kind of designed to build like muscle memory and that kind of thing. But I feel like that was trying to do something like that. But again, that's the problem is with training, is that just because you see something, especially when it comes to like physical stuff, having done a small amount of training with that kind of stuff, it's amazing how fast you get tired and how much the difference of level of strength changes the game. Like it's not even. I would love to see, and I wonder if this is out there. I would love to see someone who is a trained, like especially in a specific like a sword fighting style that would be comparable to lightsaber fighting. Because lightsaber fighting, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is very not accurate to how in real life would fighting would be.
No, it's funny. I've gone over this, and I think we should make a specific video about fighting styles. Because there's nothing that could be equivalent to a lightsaber. It would have to be something completely brand new, made up. You may be able to pull from different types of styles, but you have to consider you have a blade that is weightless.
Yeah, and I wonder, because I feel like someone has said somewhere in non-canon, again, or EU canon, the blade had some weight, but I've always speculated the blade had no weight, which I think to me that makes it kind of a cool thing, because it completely changes. Imagine just holding a stick, or like a paint can being like and just the difference of weight, I think would completely change the style. Exactly that.
Oh, absolutely. And while I think in watching it in a movie, it plays best if you pretend like it has weight to it.
Well, we know that's
just how they did it in the original.
Well, they have the sticks for the trilogies. VFX, so that's why the actors don't look like they're just carrying a non-weighted instrument, because
even George Lucas, when he was talking, this is something I watched from Mark Hamill. He had mentioned that when it was in Lucas's mind that this was to be considered a heavy object still, they didn't want them pretending like they're winging around like they do now. Like what they have is completely weightless. I think that translates better on television, because what you see now is just dancing with a sword.
Yeah, I think they lost some of it, because obviously I think to date the best thing about the Phantom Menace, I think universally considered, is the Duel of the Fates. Was just a greatly choreographed. It was a great set piece, quite enjoyable across the board. And I think that, well, I guess it goes back to what I was saying is, I know we get off topic a lot. That you'll see that a lot with us. So if you can enjoy,
this will be the general video.
Yeah, if you enjoy non sequiturs, then you'll enjoy us. But which is, the training difference. Like, I would love to see. I mean, have you ever seen? I think it's called Keto, not Keto. I think there's a sword style. I'll have to. Someone will know what it is but it's the one where they almost use the bamboo style sticks, and they'll have the face mask. It's almost like Japanese fencing kind of vibe to it.
Yes, kind of like that.
And it's amazing how fast they are. Like, you watch one of these competitions between the people, and it's over in half a second. And so I would love to see something where it's like a professional, someone because I think, didn't they add lightsaber dueling to like a legitimate sport now? Like, it's in the Olympics or something.
Yeah, I've seen them and they're terrible. It's really not amusing.
Okay,
whatsoever.
I haven't seen it, but I would love to see something.
It's like LARP fighting.
Oh goodness. Okay, well, I'd love to see something like along those lines, professional, someone who's like legitimately elite in the space like that, fight someone who's, and not just a newbie, but like, throw a newbie in there just for perspective, like someone who's like, oh, fight me, who wants to fight and not gonna be scared, but like does it. And then show like someone who's like, because the Rey character, I have no problem with her having some level of melee skills, being that she's, on this planet, she's trying to survive.
Though she would have been killed in a heartbeat. But yes, continue.
Right. I think that
we'll super suspend our disbelief.
That's fine, but giving it some level of base skill, let's say like, hey, I can fight off the average Tusken Raider type level skill. You're like, okay, I'm definitely not fighting off Jedi, but I can fight off like your average dirtbag on a planet, right? And I think that'd be interesting to see someone at that like equivalent, that level, fight against someone with swords, because I think it would be a visual
instructive.
Yeah, on the level of difference, because you do watch things where like, even look at boxers. I mean, they would snap my neck. If one of those guys hit me in the frickin' head, they would just snap my neck. And I'm not the littlest person, but I'm sure not the biggest. And the physical, and you just start, I don't think people, unless you've done it, you put some boxing gloves on and start boxing.
You'll be winded within about 10, 15 seconds.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Yeah. I think I was telling you,
conditioning is the most important. Conditioning and conserving energy when fighting are the two most important fundamental skills you have to learn on top of certain techniques, because very skilled and talented people who know what they're doing. Now this is on a one-on-one basis. Of course, if you're fighting 2 or 3 people, it's a little bit different, but once you've started to expand out of 2 or 3, your chances of survival are very, very slim, even given your talent level. However, on a one-on-one, you'll know experts because they let you waste a lot of energy and they burn you out very quickly so that they don't have to fight.
Well, that's like the whole defensive side on, using boxing. And I'm no pro at boxing. I've just felt like how when you're using gloves and boxing, it's like a boxing, a punching bag, how fast you just get exhausted. It's way faster than you would think visually.
Mm-hmm.
And so
it's not normal for most people to engage in that sphere. You know, before I started my law enforcement career, I got into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And one of the things I learned quickly, again, was that conserving energy thing, because I'm big and I am strong, but there were men who were smaller and had less muscle than me, but they had significantly more technique. And eventually they burn you out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I moved personally in the self-defense section from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to Krav Maga, because the mindsets are a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Krav Maga, the idea is that you are supposed to be, it really takes the idea of that shock and awe that the US military used to engage in into the personal fight. You come quick, you come hard, you come violent, and you defeat the enemy as quickly as possible. Because if you don't, then you go through that wearing process. And that's where Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu really gets its strength.
Got it.
As a defender,
and that's
you wear the other people out.
That's a great segue into like the whole point of the kind of this, wrap this up now for real. Which is the whole point of this, which is it's about the technique. It's not about, Obi-Wan was very powerful, but no one cares about Obi-Wan's family. No one's like, who's Obi-Wan's family? I'm sure somewhere in there's something about it in some book or novel again. But in the main stories, I don't think I ever asked when I was, growing up, oh, who's Obi-Wan's parents? Because it wasn't matter. It didn't matter. Mm-mm. And I think the same thing with Rey is only reason we care is because the movie made a point to ask it. And when the movie's based in the space that, oh, she's going to be relevant to the Skywalkers, you go, oh, whose kid is she? Is she Obi-Wan's child? Is she, I think that was always the question. Is she Luke, Han, or Obi-Wan's kid? I think is always the one. Mm-hmm. And I think actually most people liked the idea that she was Obi-Wan's child somehow, or grandchild. I think it seems to be the fan favorite. I think it's the favorite. Granted, I think it could have been cool. Sense. I think it could have been cool. It's like, again, there's so many could-haves with these ones, unfortunately, where, oh, this could be really cool. This could be really cool. But now we're at a point where we're like, well, we can't enjoy that. And I think that in the future, someday, there's probably someone out there who will write an entire remake of these movies, making the characters cool, which I think would be hilarious.
That would be
maybe
funny.
We'll do something like that. We'll do 3 movies using we have to use all the characters from these movies and rewrite it. And be like, how would we do this to use every single one of these characters but make it an interesting story? Because again, the biggest problem with these ones that we both agree on is there's no cohesion. And that's where we reference back to Lord of the Rings, which is 3 movies with coherent story beats. And now we're going to come with this next movie, which comes out, like I said, about a week and a half, I think, from where we are today, recording this. And they're adding new characters. We have no idea who some of the characters are coming in. We have characters that were added from the first one that we'll never see again. And we'll have characters from the second one we'll never see again. So I think that's the problem here, is that we're not seeing characters from the build. We're not seeing Rey build. We're not seeing Poe build, Finn build, built up as characters. We just see them kind of pop in and out versus kind of learning. I think that's probably, if I was to say something, there's probably a lot of things, but there's no learning in these stories. I don't think the characters have really learned anything. And I think,
no, absolutely
I don't think the audience through the characters, because again, I don't think that you have to be insightful to the character. There's sometimes people like, oh, I gotta live vicariously through the characters. And I think some franchises are built around that, but I think sometimes you want to learn with the characters. And I think that's what is missing a lot of in the current movies is you're not really learning anything. You're not learning more about the universe. You're not learning anything. And that's why people, even though I think that it would be really hard to make these movies, but the whole idea that the proposed new trilogy would have been about the wills and the Force and stuff, which would be super like mysticism level dealing with the Force. I think they've dealt with it a little bit in some of the Clone Wars cartoons.
And if they did that, then they would have had to put a heavy focus on Luke, which they clearly did not want to do.
Which is too bad, because I think that, I reference back to I'll probably talk about this more in the future, but using old characters with young characters can be freaking awesome. And I think it's too bad that they're so scared to do that. We talked to our dad about it, and we plan on doing something with our dad. Our dad has not seen The Last Jedi yet. He's only heard us talk about it.
Yeah,
so
we
plan on, he's seen The Force Awakens. He has not seen The Last Jedi. So we do plan on doing a thing where we bring him out and he's going to watch it, and then we're going to have commentary with him with it, because he doesn't really want to watch them. I think we're going to slight torture. I think we're going to have to bribe him with, like, I don't know, cookies or something. cookies and hot cocoa or something, and we'll be like,
No, actually, I'm going to be replacing his brakes and changing his oil. That's his reward.
car repairs help our dad out.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll have to bring him out and watch it because it'll be interesting to see his perspective. Granted, he's obviously pretty much in our camp with these things, but you know, it's gonna be hilarious, to be honest. I think it's gonna be hilarious because it's gonna be
just him seeing the milk scene for the first time in reality is gonna be I'm gonna record his face.
Oh, you do it. Yeah, you're gonna have to make sure you do it. Don't do your phone in vertical, but do it on sideways. So don't do vertical video. Vertical video is bad. So we can edit it.
Fact.
We'll have to. You have to record it during a couple of those scenes. Like that scene, the throwing over the lightsaber over the shoulder scene. What other scene will be a big one there? Definitely that one.
Let's see here. Something to know. Oh, Mary Poppins. Of
course.
Mary Poppins. Who doesn't love Mary Poppins?
That's one of the cringiest things I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
That top 3
visually.
Yeah.
Because it looks like you're watching a piece of cardboard black running behind a person.
Very, very weird.
Like,
it was a weirdly done thing.
What?
You know, VFX-wise, it was even done oddly. But anyway, that's what we have planned out for the future.
Here, before you go,
yes.
because like you said, we're talking about Rey and her lineage.
Mm-hmm.
I know that was supposed to be the primary portion of this. Something to consider too, when you go back and think. When The Force Awakens came out, there seemed to be a heavy emphasis on Finn. Of course, we didn't know his name at the time or whatever, but it seemed like this was going to be the new adventure.
In the marketing material I'm talking about, or in the actual story itself.
Yeah, in the marketing material,
Mm-hmm.
right. Yeah, and so a lot of people were like, oh, is he a Force user? He's a former stormtrooper who can use the Force. Might I remind you folks that since John Boyega is black and Finn is black, it was very unlikely, given the dynamics of the EU at the time and the dynamics that, of course, between Han and Leia and stuff like that, that he was going to be unrelated to everybody. So for those who at the beginning wanted to say, well, it's okay that Rey's superpowered because she doesn't have to be related to somebody, we had no expectation that she ever would have been related to anybody.
Oh, right. Yeah, you're saying because obviously, you know, we expected Finn's character to be something interesting. Well, and that's why we'll go back to his character because I think he's been the most underserved character in the new one.
And he thinks so too. There's no doubt.
Of course he does, because and rightfully so.
But that's what brings us back to the genetic.
Oh yeah, because I think that he could have been. He would be an interesting character because he would have
been trained.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. He would theoretically he had years of training, and we'll go deeper in him in the future because I think he's an interesting character breakdown of possibilities. I think he could have been something really special in the story.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate.
And you know why, folks? Again, it has nothing to do with his genetics. It would be the fact that he was a child that was taken and trained to be a killer. And then however they wanted to develop his conscience or whatever was somehow Force sensitive just because, hey, people have to be Force sensitive, right? The first Jedi had to come
That's
somewhere.
The only prereq for being a Jedi was Force sensitivity. I think in the different spaces, again, now we're kind of expanding somewhat into non-movie canon, which was, we know what they were taken young. Kids were brought into the Jedi super young, and they were pretty much removed from their families. So even being a Jedi wasn't really a perk job in the sense of, you came powerful, but you kind of were ostracized.
It was a sacrifice.
Yeah, it was definitely one of those weird things. So I think that's where being a Spartan child. Yeah.
Being in the underclass as a Spartan. You were taken from your family. You were trained to be a ruthless killer. And that's how your mind was going to be forever.
Yeah. So actually an interesting thing, because there's almost a parallel there. That's what's too bad there. You have the parallel of the Jedi take you and train to be the Force sensitive. And then you had Finn, who was taken as a child to be a killer. So obviously, that's a whole segue, and we wanted to go in that more. I think that's actually a really interesting topic we'll do in the future.
All right, we'll write that down. But that swings back to what I was going to say about Rey. Mm-hmm. Her genetics don't matter. It matters about being trained. Now, genetics could matter if they really wanted to push this in the Force universe for her eventual power level through training. What people seem to misunderstand, and I don't know if it's intentionally missing the argument or if it's their way of skirting the argument because they need to shill for whatever reason. But it's one thing to say, Avatar: The Last Airbender, having rewatched it now with my wife, for her seeing it for the first time. Katara doesn't know anything other than some minor water bending that she happened to pick up while she was living. You know, she knew her mother. Her mother was killed. All the men in the Southern Water Tribe are taken away. So she's the only one. She's kind of trying to learn for herself this weird ability that she has. Well, when she goes to the Northern Water Tribe and gets trained, she outperforms everybody. Now, here's the thing.
Well,
she was still trained.
Yeah, not masters, but she outperformed people.
All of her students, right?
Her fellow students.
And what the guy tells him is, you were the hardest working, you were the most persistent, you were the most dedicated, you were the most devoted, you were the most present person here. And he was even putting her above the Avatar in that he was, kind of giving him a backhand saying, opposed to just raw talent. So she was talented, but she also put in the work and effort, and it put her head and above everybody else. And that's why you accept her character being very, very skilled, even though, as you could say, well, she's related to so-and-so. Nobody would have complained if Rey eventually became the most powerful Jedi. No one would have whined, or the same thing, if Finn was actually the main character, nobody would have complained about that, because they would have said, well, sure, it makes sense.
Yeah, it's the growth over time. You start
recreated at the lowest part of the Jedi Order. Everyone's gone except for him. He would be relearning things himself and then reteaching someone so they could learn faster and get better and become more present. Nobody would complain about that. It's I'm already insta 100%. Oh, I've heard about the Force. I can now control people's minds and fend off a Jedi.
Yeah, and that's definitely
the stuff.
Yeah,
that's stupid.
And that's where, again, it's exactly that, which is we want to see growth. And again, that's where the whole growth part. I don't think there's any growth in these. You start, I said, even look at the original trilogy, and then we'll wrap up here with, obviously Luke starting out as the little simple farm boy and then ending up relatively powerful. And even the point of the we talked about this recently, even at the point of the Return of the Jedi,
but he still gets defeated.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, he is defeated, and he only beat Vader barely through channeling the darkness. And he, in the sense of it, he wasn't even his full level. He'd only been training for a year after that point. I think he'd been. So from Yoda, maybe
a year or two.
Yeah, I forget exactly. There was a little bit of time, but it wasn't like and he was probably in that space too. I'm sure that's where the canon novels would be interesting. Is you're probably like, oh, he probably was training super, super, super duper hard. And even in the story, he wasn't overpowering everything. Like he could have gone in the new level of canon, they would have just gone into Jabba's palace and ripped it apart from the ground up and just picked it up and just ripped it to shreds.
It would have made him explode.
Yeah. In the story here, they're not trying. That story was more about, the Force is like a tool versus a blunt instrument. And I think that's the difference of the older to the new. That just is that the old stuff used the Force as like a scalpel, and the new stuff uses as a sledgehammer. And I think that's the unfortunate part, which is, hey, we'd love to see, like I said, go back to the original Clone Wars cartoon from the early 2000s, and you get to see Mace Windu be a sledgehammer, and it's freaking amazing.
Dismantles entire droid armies with his hands.
It's a beautiful
jumps
thing.
like 6 miles.
But
again, there's a difference between watching that in cartoon than there is in the actual movies.
Yeah,
for some
and I would love to see that in the movies.
Transfer sign to cartoons, it becomes acceptable.
Well, and I would love to see that translate into live action. To be honest, I think that'd be freaking so cool. But again, it's the unfortunate part, which is, I want to see the character who's shown to be
nobody's talented enough to do that, because it requires, if you're going to create someone like that so powerful, a group of people so powerful like that, you have to put the environment that they're in a very dangerous, deadly, overpowering situation. And the people who would do that don't have the talent. I've never seen it. Why don't you tell us about One Punch Man and how they've taken a character who is
that's
OP
an
absurd
and that's
level,
on parody. That's almost a parody on the superhero space. But we'll get into that more later. I think we're going to wrap up though for today, and we have a lot of good topics to talk on in the future here. And I think that you can obviously tell we like to ramble and chat. So hopefully you enjoyed our thing. Thank you, Philip, for joining us today.
Disease.
Oh yeah, right. You're like, our parents like to talk. You have seen nothing yet. And wait till we hopefully get our other brother here, and so you'll have the 3 brothers.
Yeah, he's always fun to have
chatting
around.
because
he's amusing.
He's a little more on my perspective. Like I said, being kind of an anime fan, he's like a light anime fan. I'm like a heavy anime fan, and anime fan. But
he's an exuberant personality, though.
Yes.
I'll have to make sure to, when he talks, to crank the gain down by like 30.
Oh yes. We'll have to give a mic in a separate room. You're like, hey,
no joke,
like, Christopher, come over. Oh, you need to be in the garage so we don't hear you bleed over into our microphone with excitement.
Lock you in the closet and pour all the clothes that I own on top of you.
So we don't hear it. But yes, but thank you, Philip, for joining us today. And thank
My
you,
pleasure. Thank you for having
everyone,
me.
for listening to us. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll talk to you next time.